I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. And we know that California is going through a particularly tough time right now. And so we really appreciate you spending some time with us and those of you in the San Joaquin Valley in particular. So our thoughts are with you. And now that the stay-at-home order has been issued, I think that this conversation about housing during the pandemic is particularly timely. So thank you, everyone. My name is Bonnie Bertram, and I'm a senior producer at Retro Report, overseeing our reporting on evictions for a series we're calling Hitting Home. And we're thrilled to be hosting today's panel discussion. Retro Report is a nonprofit journalism organization, and our aim is to provide historical context to today's headlines. And our reporting in Fresno on housing and illness has uncovered some really interesting parallels from today, going back 100 years to the 1918 flu pandemic. Last spring, when the pandemic hit, we realized that the widespread job losses were likely going to make it hard for people to pay rent and put them at risk of losing their homes. So we started working with the Eviction Lab in Princeton, and our Fresno story is one of 3 short films focusing on local issues in different cities, and it will culminate in a longer documentary. And what we hope to do is provide viewers with a more comprehensive and sort of more intimate look at what's involved in an eviction and how they actually happen and what's at stake when they do. So that centerpiece documentary, Hitting Home, will be out later this summer. And in the meantime, our short documentary about historic housing patterns in Fresno and illness and the impact on the Latinx community in particular is coming out in the next few weeks. And we really are looking forward to sharing that with all of you. It features reporting by Fresno's own Dan Casares, who will be moderating today's discussion. Dan was with the McClatchy newspaper chain for nearly 20 years, including a time as a writer with the bilingual newspaper Vida en el Valle. And we're lucky to have his feet on the ground reporting on this project since June. Before we begin, I especially want to thank the James Irvine Foundation, the Center at Sierra Health Foundation, and the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund for supporting today's discussion. It's a testament to how important this topic is, and we really appreciate all of you giving us the time to talk about this. Today's discussion will last about an hour, with the last 15 to 20 minutes reserved for answering questions that you can post in the chat. We also have a behind-the-scenes monitor who will be fielding your questions and posting several polls we hope you'll respond to during the hour. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Casares.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who is here joining us today on this very important topic that is hitting, well, not only the Fresno area, but throughout the entire nation and globally, as you know. Let me begin by saying it's an honor to have such guests with us here today. What a lineup, honestly, well done. Thank you for being with us. I know every one of you are experts in your field, which is why we want your participation. I'll get to the discussion in just a bit, but just briefly, at Retro Report, we've diligently been working and talking with experts about Fresno's history. It's really been 2 cities. There is the Fresno where white Americans were historically set up to live. Then the dividing line of Fresno that's home to people of color and immigrants who worked here, whether it was building the railroads nearly a century ago, or working the thousands of acres of farmland throughout the Central Valley, and many immigrants continue to do so today. This line dividing the 2 Fresnos has moved over the years, a sort of migration. But throughout the city's history, there are those on the less privileged side who have led different lives and have had different experiences with disease, disparities in healthcare than their more privileged neighbors. Several of you already know me. I've been a journalist for about 20 years in the Fresno area. I was born in Fresno and raised in Caldwell, South Fresno, today considered one of the impoverished neighborhoods. Like all of you, I've struggled to achieve my goals. I picked grapes, pruned and tied vines as a youngster, picked cherry tomatoes with my family. I've been a journalist, as said, for about 20 years or so. One of my first assignments at about 18 years old was taking photos of UFW co-founder Cesada Chavez in Delano. I won't tell you how old I am now. Having said that, let's move on. I think we have a great panel of guests here today. So let me introduce our panelists. If you can please respond with your name, where you are and where you're from, your preferred pronoun if you like. Let's begin with Ben Metcalf is the Managing Director of the Terner Center of Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley in Northern California. The Terner Center leverages applied research and best practices to inform and advance innovation in the planning, financing, design, and development of homes and communities. Before the Terner Center, Ben was a director of California Department of Housing and Community Development. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
And
and my preferred pronouns, he, him, his, hers.
Gotcha. Where are you today, sir?
I'm here in the East Bay in Oakland.
Very good. A lot colder than Central Valley.
It is indeed.
Next, we have Brandy Snow, our legal advice. Oh, pardon me. Brandy Snow joins us from the housing team at Central California Legal Services in Fresno. Brandy is the co-lead on the housing team, and among other things that she does there, she focuses on eviction defense, which is truly vital in today's landscape of looming evictions. With co-lead Nikki Love, during this current eviction crisis, they are creating new strategies to address the rising number of cases to help many at-risk tenants. And by the way, before I forget, let's mention, if you need help, their legal advice line is 800-675-8001. Welcome, Brandy.
Thank you, Dan. It's Brandy Snow, she, her, hers. And as Dan said, I'm the housing co-lead at CCLS. I focus on eviction defense and supervise a team of aggressive litigators. That's what we're trying to do, is expand our ability to help people who are going through this housing crisis, not only in Fresno County, but also Tulare, Merced, Kings. We service a number of areas in the Valley. But we are hopefully going to be able to share with you some things that we've been able to put together today. And also, as Dan said, our legal advice line for anyone who needs help with housing issues, please give us a call.
Very good. Thank you so much, Brandy. Next, we have Dr. Dempna Oguochu, who is a replacement today, and you are very welcome to join us. Danielle Bergstrom of Fresno Land could not make it today, and Dr. Dempna Oguochu is a senior editor with Fresno Land at the Fresno Bee. Dempna has edited all of the reporting this year on evictions and the region's growing housing crisis, and has done her own reporting on ongoing segregation, environmental justice, and food security issues in the region. Dempna was a full-time instructor of journalism at Fresno City College, advising the college newspaper, coaching and mentoring hundreds of aspiring journalists. Welcome, Dempna.
Thank you very much. And it's she, her, and hers. It's truly an honor to be here.
Thank you so much. We're so pleased to have you. Next, we have Mario A. Gonzalez. Mario is a first-generation immigrant from Mexico who currently serves as the Deputy Director for Centro El Familia Advocacy Services in Southwest Fresno. Mario earned his Juris Doctorate from San Joaquin College of Law just last year. Congratulations. He works with Director Margarita Rocha, who has led the agency for over 3 decades. In 2009, they moved the organization's headquarters from downtown Fresno to Southwest Fresno. Why? To make sure the delivery and access of services are easier met for the people who need them the most. Mario, welcome. Bienvenido.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. My name is Mario Gonzalez. As mentioned, I'm with Centro La Familia. I'm actually working out of our Highway City office today. We have 3 offices, one in Kerman, one in West Fresno, and one in Highway City. Our focus has always been to ensure that we make ourselves available to the communities and ensure that we address the barrier of transportation. We are actually in the process of launching a new office in Mendota, and so that's another breakthrough to the barriers that we see in our communities.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. Well, let's get right to it. As everyone knows, California is on a stay-at-home order. It's just implemented because of COVID-19. There are less than 6% of available ICU beds in our hospitals in the Fresno area. Ben, let me direct, if you don't mind, let's begin with you. Can you talk about in your research as to how the pandemic is experienced differently according to the parts of town where someone might live? And how does Fresno compare to other parts of the state?
Sure. So first, let me just acknowledge that this is a very, very difficult time for everybody, no matter where they live or where they work. But it's definitely the case, and in the work that we've done over the last year, that we've seen differential impacts accumulating to different communities, particularly when we've looked within California. And I would highlight sort of two buckets of real concern from where we sit. The primary, obviously, are our renters. Most of our homeowners have been able to take advantage of the forbearance levers that exist to be able to push back mortgage payments to the extent that they've suffered economic losses during this time. But it is really our renters that have been the most vulnerable and have seen the greatest challenges accumulate to them. Now, luckily, we have not seen mass evictions. So although folks have been unable to pay their rent, we have not seen a lot of folks turned out on the street. That's not to say that we haven't had any. In fact, there are many well-documented examples here in California, even during the current eviction moratorium, of folks who have been forced out of their homes or who have been threatened by implicitly or explicitly by eviction and have chosen to leave sort of their own accord, if you will, although under duress. But we're really, really concerned. And the folks, these renters who are most impacted in our work do tend to be obviously folks who are lower income to start with. They also tend to be from our communities of color. So disproportionately Latinx, Black renters. These are folks who are hitting this triple whammy of higher propensity for health impact with the disease, higher propensity of being in the jobs that are most impacted by the shutdown, and then higher likelihood that they're living as renters in more vulnerable housing altogether. That triple whammy is brutal. And when you look at the numbers of people who are most likely to suffer and be challenged, it is unfortunately our low-income communities of color, particularly in our locations, our neighborhoods, where we see higher concentrations of those populations. And one of the things I'll say is it's still a little bit of a silent or invisible challenge in our neighborhoods, because so many folks have been able to take advantage, very fortunately, of the eviction moratorium. They have technically retained their housing. But what we're seeing is that folks, even if they are able to retain their housing, are accumulating very significant backlogs of arrearages of back rent. By some estimates, there may be $1.7 billion of back rent that is accumulated and unpaid as we roll into 2021. Now, again, it's good they're not being evicted for non-payment, but it's really worrisome that we may have an entire sort of generation of renters who come out of this pandemic saddled by not just student debt, not just medical debt, not just debt on a credit card or a car loan, but a whole new class of debt that now sets them further behind in their ability to keep up. So we're really worried about that. And then the second thing I can talk a little bit later about, I think we also are worried about most of our rental housing statewide, most of the rental housing in Fresno is not in large apartment buildings that are owned by institutional owners. In fact, most Californians, most Fresnos, if they're renters, live in rental housing that's owned by small, typically mom and pop owners who themselves are disproportionately often first generation immigrant or often lower income. They don't have, and we're seeing that they don't have the ability, and they're telling us in surveys, they don't have the confidence that they're going to be able to continue to make payments on their smaller properties. So we're also very worried of that natural affordability going away, of that stock being acquired by institutional investors or going into foreclosure. So that's the other area of real concern for us.
Okay, let me take a moment, everyone, to introduce, and my apologies, Seamus, I skipped you. So sorry, sir. Seamus Roller is the executive director of the National Housing Law Project, which was founded in 1968 as part of the War on Poverty to serve as a support center for the newly created legal services agencies. The organization works at the crossroads of housing and community development, legal services for the poor, and civil rights. Prior to the NHLP, Seamus was the executive director of Housing California, an advocacy organization focusing on issues of housing and homelessness. Seamus, so sorry, welcome.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm in San Francisco right now. We have a number of offices around the country, but maybe most importantly, in the north part of the valley. I was born in between Redding and Red Bluff, and really happy to be on with you all today.
We're so good to have you. My apologies once again.
No.
Getting back to what Ben was talking about, and with regard to the evictions, Brandy, I think this is a great place for you to chime in on. What have you heard through CCLS?
Sure. To add on to what Ben said, we are seeing a lot of people who are accumulating this debt, even once they file the required declaration with their landlord and they say, okay, I can't throw you out. That rent is being deferred. They still owe it, and that is a big concern. The other thing we're seeing a lot of is that the current eviction moratorium only is a moratorium on the basis of non-payment of rent. So we're seeing cases where landlords who aren't getting the rent are instead finding another reason. And, varying validity. Absolutely, a landlord has the right, and even when other people are involved, the obligation to deal with health and safety violations. But we're seeing things where we know, because of the discussions that the tenant has had with their landlord, that it's probably a pretext. And there's protection for that, but we have to prove it, and it's very hard to prove. So normally we see somewhere around maybe 25% of the cases that we have coming in are not for non-payment of rent. Right now, it's close to half of the cases we have coming in where a UD has been filed that are ostensibly, at least, not for non-payment of rent. They're for some other reason, an unauthorized person or a nuisance, or these ways around the current moratorium. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we're worried about going forward is it's very hard to prove that pretext. And so we're seeing people, yes, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you if you could define UD, unlawful detainer.
I'm so sorry. Yes.
No
An unlawful detainer is the court action for an eviction. So the process usually happens this way. A notice is served to the person who is the primary renter, and it says either you have 3 days to cure or quit. You have, in this current moratorium, we have 15 days for payment. So you have 15 days to pay or quit meaning leave. And so there's a sort of a cascading situation there where some people will see that notice and say, I don't know if it's valid or not, I better just leave. Some people will try to cure, some people will try to pay. People have the option right now, if it's a non-payment, to file a declaration that says I've been impacted by COVID and my income is impacted, and therefore you can't evict me. So when that's done properly and when tenants know that they have that right, those are the folks that Ben was talking about who can't be evicted right now, but they're acquiring that debt, it's building up. But then with these other situations, what happens is when the notice expires, if the person hasn't left or the condition, whatever it might be, hasn't been cured, then the landlord can file the unlawful detainer action in court. And that's the process that starts legally and very quickly to have someone removed through a court order from their home.
Brandy, if I may ask briefly, how many cases have you seen just this year that are coming to you that are illegal evictions or illegal attempts at evictions?
That can fall under a couple of different categories. What we think of generally when we talk about illegal evictions is what we call self-help, where the landlord, tosses your things in the yard and locks the door, changes the locks, or turns off the utilities. I would estimate, and I have to estimate, I didn't unfortunately pull this data, but I would estimate that we've had somewhere around 60 of those really just since September, where we've had calls at least to our legal advice line, and that's either threatened or it's been done. We have then another category that are sort of illegal evictions, but they're more in what, like Ben was talking about, coerced, okay, where the person has the choice, in air quotes, if you didn't see my air quotes there, to leave before action is taken. And so that's not technically illegal, depending on how much coercion and what kind of coercion, but it certainly falls into a category that we can't reach in data in terms of telling how many people have been forced out of their homes because it's never filed
Okay.
for it.
Very good. Okay. In my reporting, literally walking the streets of Fresno and literally going to people's front yards and N95 mask, and they're sharing their stories with me. I did find some cases like that of coercion and some intimidation. And I'd like to ask Mario. Mario, what I have found when I've spoken to undocumented immigrants was that they were simply willing to, a very good friend told me just yesterday, pay the rent before buying food. My very good friend being Bonnie. Mario, your thoughts on that with regard to, because they are undocumented immigrants, they simply don't want to bring any attention to themselves and are making this huge sacrifice. Can you tell us what you have heard?
So that's correct, Dan. We've been seeing a lot of families go without food. We've seen a lot of food insecurities in our communities because they'd rather pay the rent to have a place to stay and live and go with just the bare minimums for food and at times go without eating. We try to address some of this through providing assistance through the housing retention grants. So we partner up with the city of Fresno, the county of Fresno to ensure that families who may qualify for some monetary assistance could apply through our office to obtain that rental assistance to ensure that they can keep their homes or stay in their homes so that they can actually spend the money that they're earning on purchasing food for themselves. We've also partnered with the Consulate of Mexico to actually address food insecurities in our rural communities. And since the month of May, for about once a month or so, we go out to the rural communities like Huron, Mendota, San Joaquin, Biola, out in the rural communities, and we try and provide food for those families. We try to service anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 families at those events to drive through food distributions, because food insecurity is a real crisis that's occurring because families are having now to decide whether they're going to eat or pay for a roof over their head. So it's an unfortunate unfortunate cost of the pandemic that even though that they're working or finding some work, be it in the fields, be it in and some other form of construction or other form of work, a lot of the jobs that they have been taking or had been taking, like in hotels and motels and in restaurants, is no longer available. It's limited work. And so with that, they're having to find ways to maintain and just sustain themselves. We have seen a kind of a crisis of sorts from this, because we have individuals who are contracting COVID, and because they're living in the same household as other individuals, as other family members, there's more exposure to COVID. And the pandemic itself is exploding within the immigrant communities because majority of them live in shared housing because they're all trying to stay alive and stay under a roof. And so we'll have multiple families living together. And so that's causing a additional stress or additional exposure to to COVID itself.
Yes, yeah, it is amazing. In Fresno County, Hispanics lead the death rate on COVID-19 related illnesses. It's very sad. Seamus, if I could get you to weigh in on, the policies of the state, and maybe, what sort of changes do you think, leaders can make, in maybe in the coming years, sooner than later, hopefully, that will help maybe take away from pandemics. In case some of our viewers don't know, what we uncovered at Retro Report is about during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. In areas of South Fresno, the most vulnerable people of color, were affected most 100 years ago. And they were the first victims to fall to the flu pandemic. Again, here we are, 2020, this pandemic. And it's the same stats in the same area. Seamus, if I could get you to weigh in on that, what are your thoughts?
Well, there's so much in that question.
Yes.
I think that one of the things to be, that I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more, is that the reason that we face such housing discrimination in places like Fresno, but across the country, is not because of some, set of decisions necessarily by individual people alone, that the federal government played a huge role, and also the state government did as well, in creating segregation and in creating neighborhoods where people live in concentrated poverty and live in segregation. And that over time, what that often meant is that people of color paid higher rents than they would have if they lived in integrated neighborhoods, right? That they had fewer choices about where to live. And so, if you look at a place like on the south side of Chicago, you see all these old houses that have been split up into small apartments. Well, the reason they were split up is because African Americans had limited number of places that they could live. And so they had to live in crowded conditions and pay higher rents than they would have if they had a different color of skin. And so I think, there is a real obligation, both for the state government, but also for the federal government to take a real step forward and address segregation. And that the way that we see with evictions is that it plays out along those same lines. You find that if you look at where serial evictions occur, where the highest levels of evictions occur, often in those neighborhoods that have been historically segregated.
Mhm.
And I think this combination of what we find ourselves in right now, right? I mean, there are real problems around the eviction system nationally and in California before the pandemic started. And then on top of it, right, we have a pandemic in which that the people who are facing eviction right now, in many cases, are the people who've lost their jobs, not because they weren't in, sort of economically productive areas. They're facing eviction because we forced them to lose their jobs to protect the rest of us. That their unemployment and financial situation is directly tied to keeping all of us safe. And the idea that on top of everything else that's going on in their lives and the risks that they face, we're going to kick them out of their houses is particularly unjust, in my opinion.
That is so interesting, amazing. Dr. Ogawochu, if you don't mind weighing in on that, I know your research has taken you through policy and inequality. Can I get you to weigh in on that as well, please?
Absolutely. It's been great listening to all of you, and I come to this panel from a reporter's and an editor's perspective, from the work that I've done personally and the work that some of the reporters that I work with have done. For instance, at the beginning of the pandemic, I set out to do a story on food insecurity. And as I interviewed, I came to the realization that pandemic or not, it's the same vulnerable communities, the people of color, the poor, the immigrants, people who have been disenfranchised in our community, especially in Fresno, when we are still living with the impacts of redlining, which divided Fresno, as many of us have already referenced, a tale of two cities, one that's poor and made up of people of color, and one that is white. Two different perspectives, one that thrives, the other where the quality of education, the quality of life, even life expectancy, as much as a 20-year gap between the people who live in South Fresno and the people who live in North Fresno. And then when you couple that with unemployment, with this poverty that's just been made worse by the pandemic and everything else, there's no way we can separate. And, I looked at the title of this panel, Lessons We've Learned from the Past. Really, what lessons? Until we address the policies that keep a certain segment of the population poor and struggling, there really isn't any lessons that's been learned. It has to be the path forward. What are we going to do to create equity, to empower people, whether they are renters? I mean, I read stories about landlords who really do not care about the well-being of the tenants who live in their communities. Or we even think, my reporters are writing about water, the right to clean drinking water. What about the right to breathe in air that is clean? it has to be about equity. It has to be about policies, because we don't make, none of us here are part of the group that make the policies. There has to be a better way so that we are not telling these stories over and over and over again.
Yes, well said, Doctor. Ben, I think you can elaborate on policy and history and maybe hopefully the way of a better future.
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, Seamus also spoke a little bit to this, but
Yes.
you know,
Yep.
we have a combination of governmental policies that have effectuated the choices that people now have in terms of where they live, and I should say it's not just a question of sort of zoning and kind of what was allowed to be built where. It's not just a question of formal discrimination. It's also been a question of financing. And so for many folks, the path to homeownership has been very challenged because of their inability to access competitive financing or to access competitive financing in those neighborhoods where homes exist. I should say, you know, I recently was looking at some work that was done around the federal housing voucher and efforts to make it easier for voucher holders to access neighborhoods that have higher resources, better access to jobs and opportunities. And there are two challenges. One is that the housing voucher that's available today, actually three challenges. One is that the housing voucher available today is very scarce. It's very hard to access them in terms of extremely long wait lists. Maybe 1 in 4, 1 in 5 California households and can actually, who be eligible for it, can access it. The second is that the payment benefit that it receives is often inadequate to pay the rent in those neighborhoods where the greatest resources and jobs are available. And the third is that in some neighborhoods, there simply are no rental opportunities because of sort of what the housing stock looks like. You don't have rental apartments. You have predominantly single family detached homes that are not being rented out. So these are the kinds of things that I think each one of them needs to be sort of unpacked and remedied. And I think we need to get very creative in terms of figuring out ways to break through and make some progress on it. And I guess I would say it's not as simple as sort of just doing better enforcement. It's not as simple as simply removing these racist policies. I do think we need sort of affirmatively to figure out ways to give folks access to the resources, to the counseling, to the financing, to be able to change these trend lines.
Well, anyone here, but maybe Mario and or Brandy can weigh in. Brandy can weigh in with regard to how do you get the word out? And I know Mario, there is a housing retention grant in Fresno today, isn't there?
Mhm.
That's correct, and we are one of the holders of the funds or the process for both the county and the city. So we are helping hundreds of individuals who, you know, because of COVID have not been able to pay. It is limited funding, and it is there's a cap on how much each person can qualify for. Doesn't necessarily cover the entirety of the rent that they owe, but it is a help towards that. Means you know, it is an opportunity for individuals to apply for and obtain this benefit. We don't ask for status. It is not a requirement of the process. We don't care what the status of the individual is. We never ask. It's just as long as they qualify, they're COVID impacted, we're more than happy to help them through the process if they're eligible.
Brandy, can you talk about sort of the programs are available as well?
Sure, we often refer people to Center La Familia. So there's a back and forth there, and we get referrals from them as well. And what we're able to do right now is when someone is facing, we have both a homelessness prevention program and also our COVID eviction defense, or our eviction defense, which is now COVID, I guess is more accurate. It's always there. And one of the things that we're really working on is trying to figure out how to negotiate with landlords, because we're in this holding pattern with the non-payment cases. And then we have so many of these other cases, like I mentioned before, that are coming in that maybe they're really non-payment cases, but they don't present that way so they can go forward. And so we're trying to figure out, sometimes it's as easy as a landlord or a property owner knowing that the person has legal assistance. Sometimes that greases the wheels quite a bit by itself. I don't want to get into anyone's motivations there, but sometimes that by itself actually helps come to an agreement. When not, we do full scope representation for as many people as we possibly can. The concern we have is that we know we're not reaching anywhere near 10% of the people who need help. If I had to estimate, I'd say it's probably closer to 5%, but somewhere between 5 and 10% of people who need our help know about us at the right time, know how to contact us, know they have any options or any reason to contact us as opposed to move out. And so one of the things you mentioned earlier is how do we get the word out? And every means possible. Anyone we can find who might be willing to make referrals, Demna's reporters sometimes contact us with questions, and we're always absolutely, I will go on the record with you. Please put our phone number in so that people know they can contact us. And it's difficult because the thing we know is that somewhere between 1% and 3% of people who have a UD filed against them in court will have legal representation, where the majority of landlords who go into court for an eviction will have legal representation. And it's an uneven playing field from the beginning. And so being able to reach people is a really important part of what we do.
Brandy,
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that when we were first looking into this problem of evictions and what was happening during the pandemic, we realized that one of the biggest problems is that people who are being evicted often don't know what their rights are, and especially if their status is not secure. And so we thought that Fresno was really representative of that, in particular because so many tenants are particularly vulnerable because of their status, and the challenge of letting them know that they do have rights and that there are resources. We thought Fresno in a way was emblematic of that.
I think that's true. And I think that that gets to the heart of several issues. Obviously, not having counsel, not knowing that you have rights. Many people, there's a very short filing deadline for an answer. So most civil cases that happen in the legal system, someone files a complaint against you, you have 30 days to answer. In an unlawful detainer, you have 5 business days to answer. And so the vast majority of people who have a UD filed against them get defaulted before they even know that they should have consulted legal counsel. It's a huge problem that we see and would love to find ways to address. So that's one of the reasons that we are doing as much outreach as we can and trying to make sure people know to call us or call anyone who can give legal help. But we do a lot of Know Your Rights campaigns as well. My co-lead, Nikki Love, runs that part of our program. And we try to do Know Your Rights anywhere and everywhere that we're invited.
Just to interject, also, I mean, the other crazy thing about the eviction process is that it can actually be economically not beneficial to the owners themselves. And so we're at the Terner Center just kicking off a project right now, working with a network of property owners who are trying to rethink their own eviction procedures, and looking at what happens when you bring credit, essentially tenant, renter, and credit counseling, you onboard that earlier in the process. The hope and the theory may be that it could be in owners' incentives to actually work constructively with helping their own tenants to get access to the resource and counseling they need, because it saves them from incurring the cost of hiring an attorney and having a vacant unit and having to turn over a structure. So we're still a few months away from having anything to tell about that, but hopefully we will be able to share something useful.
That's really great. I look forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah.
Seamus, it looked like you wanted to say something there. Your thoughts?
Well, just that CCLS is also the only significant organization providing pro bono assistance to tenants, right? And that, Brandy hit on this, but this idea of how quick the eviction process is, it is the fastest civil procedure that there is across the country. It moves at such a rapid rate that, the vast majority of people just get a default, that they just process evictions in seconds in the courtrooms, and that's pretty problematic as we think about how this works. One of the attorneys on my staff used to work in Fresno. One of the things that he said about the process too, he's like, the judges that you have in the eviction court are the brand new judges, and that they are often, district attorneys, and that they're learning civil procedure while they're in the room. And the only people that they have to learn from is the 5 or 6 eviction mill right, attorneys who work for the landlords who are sort of teaching them the ropes, right? There are so many little parts of this system that produce the end result that we find ourselves with, right? That there's so many breakdowns in the eviction process, in the housing system, that ended up with the result, which is one thing that we've talked about is sort of the racial disparities, but also the gender disparities in that evictions hit women at a much higher rate than they do men.
Yeah, it's
If I could
tragic.
add on
Yes,
to that a
Brandy,
little bit.
please, yes.
To that a little bit. And women with children are even more vulnerable, and not only vulnerable to the eviction process, but vulnerable to the trauma that comes with it. Schools have to be changed, or, you know, there are truancy issues. There's a lot of trauma associated with even temporary homelessness, or even no homelessness in an abrupt change of housing that's involuntary. And it does impact women and women with children disparately. And I think that's where it comes back to just the, to build on what Seamus said, how fast it moves, and to be standing in court and to see that stamp go down. And no, that's about a family's housing, and it got no more consideration than stamp default. And that's not really any individual's purpose. I'm not arguing that that's being inappropriately handled in the court, so much as that the system is set up to disregard that need so quickly.
Yes.
And it can be very disturbing.
Brandy, if you don't mind, maybe just briefly going into the ratio between attorneys in the area who help renters versus the number of attorneys that help landlords.
You know, I don't know the exact size of our landlord bar. I know that there are 8 to 10 attorneys we deal with very regularly. As far as representing low-income tenants, certainly for pro bono help, it's mostly us. We have a pro bono network of private attorneys who will help us out if we can get the cases to them quickly enough. But it's mostly CCLS.
However, your caseload for you and your office is huge, isn't it? I mean, how are you able to help so many people?
So we have a couple of different ways that we do that. We have what we call case acceptance guidelines, that we figure out what our priorities are, who most needs our help, and how we're going to be able to help the most people. And those cases are going to come directly to my team, to my litigation team, to be litigated as full scope defense. We have another set of cases that will come to my team, but they may be unbundled services where we help file an answer, or we help with a set aside. A set aside being when someone has been defaulted, but there's a good reason the judge should reconsider. And so we have those sort of tiers of cases that come to us. We also have our legal advice line, who can advise tenants who need help, for instance, with something simple like, what should I do next? What does this notice mean? And sometimes what they need is someone just to explain to them, the notice says if you don't have your adult child move out within 3 days, they're going to file an eviction. And so your choices are A, B, and C. And then we have a virtual clinic that we're running for people who have the capacity to do a Zoom call, where we can help someone fill out their answer to answer in pro per. And we also have, like I said, our network of private attorneys who are willing to take some cases for us about habitability issues and things that get more complicated than we can do efficiently. The Disability Rights Council takes some of our referrals for reasonable accommodation cases. We use every source we can find, I guess, is the short answer. And we try to extend our ability to help as much as we can.
Very good. Okay.
Thank you, Seamus. I see your comment. I went right past that, didn't I?
Dr. Oguochu, I know you've felt and, you know, of course, witnessed all the frustration. You edit every story that comes out of Fresno land there. And well, your thoughts, can you continue?
Yes, we at Fresno land, you know, our lab, we're a lab at the B. So we focus on issues of housing, water, land use, and community inequalities. So it intersects with everything that's been brought up today. And we try to write stories that provide solutions. In other words, because it's hard to just write about the difficulties without providing solutions. For example, when we write about issues with eviction, we always try to provide them some help. Okay, here are the ways that you can fight this, or here are the people that can help you, and hopefully guide some more tenants to recognizing that they have a right to fight and not give up so quickly. Because in Fresno, as much as 60% of Fresno residents rent. Okay, they don't own their homes. And we also have to consider the stability that comes with home ownership. And when you live in some communities, that isn't existent. So it's our commitment in Fresno land to focus on issues, to give people, I guess, the voice in ways that they're not empowered to. And we often translate our stories into Spanish also, so that way there's more readership and more people can be reached in that way.
Very good idea. Yes, that's always helpful, especially here in the Central Valley. Mario, with regard to that, what being on the front line sometimes there in Southwest Fresno at Central, can you characterize maybe an undocumented person needing help? When you've spoken to them, you yourself, you grew up as a farm worker, you were a child laborer here in the local areas. Proceed, please continue.
Yeah, so from that personal experience, I mean, I did come into this country undocumented myself, started working in the fields, worked my way up in farm, as a farmhand. And from first-hand experience, we know the struggles that a immigrant faces and the lack of services, because a lot of entities, when you request services, you have to have some kind of lawful status to obtain that recourse, that resource. If you want legal representation, you need to have lawful status for the most part if you want it for free. Unfortunately, but there are ways around that. There are ways to obtain additional services without having status. There are limitations to the services. There's limitations because if you're an entity is receiving LSC funds, then they are not able to represent someone who's undocumented. However, agencies like ours, Centro La Familia, and others, we don't require or request any kind of status. We ensure that we look for funds that will not restrict how we work and how we provide services. So there are other organizations. There are a lot of great entities here in the Central Valley and Fresno who are working to address the issues of ensuring that services are made available not just to those with lawful status, but anyone with the need can obtain that recourse. We don't have any attorneys, unfortunately, at Centro La Familia yet. However, we can provide access to information. We'll reach out on behalf of clients to CCLS, to some of our local partners, to ask questions on their behalf. They might not be able to represent them, but they can guide us through that information. So there's always a loophole. There's always a way to get the information and get it to the families that need it. And that's what we are. I mean, we try to be that voice. We try to be that point for families.
Yes, very good. Okay, well, we have some questions here. I think it's probably a good time to get to our Q&A. Let's see here. We have one from Karen Sugru of Retro Report. A question for the journalists here and of the panelists. One thing COVID has done is change some of the media narrative around evictions. Instead of deadbeats, we are seeing them, quote unquote, suddenly as hardworking people who are facing really terrible choices. I wonder how you all feel about that shift as we look ahead to the future of housing and eviction issues. Can we get some? Yes, please, Brenda.
I'm a talker, so anybody who wants to jump in, feel free. But I would say that we always see people who have made hard choices when we have clients come to us. COVID has made the choices harder, and it has enhanced a lot of the problems that people already had. But the majority of our cases there are exceptions, there are always exceptions. The majority of the people who come to us are not deadbeats who don't want to pay their rent. They're not deadbeats who don't want to work. There are people who have made those hard choices, and they always have been. COVID presents a lot more hard choices, and it's kind of nice to see the media coverage to the extent that it has been more sympathetic to tenants who are facing eviction. That's lovely to see. But I think the suddenness that's being referred to there is, I'll go all the way, it's absurd. It hasn't changed the number of people who are facing eviction because of their economic disadvantages, the difficulties, the bad choices that they've had to make because there weren't any good ones. And so I'll then let somebody else address that as well.
Yes, please, Dr. Ogwuchin.
I think that what COVID has done, I think it's opened more people's eyes. In other words, but for the grace of God, I too could be in that situation, because all of a sudden we've lost employment, we've lost our relatives, we've lost the ability to go wherever we want. So in many ways, we can empathize with people. Unfortunately, some of these people have struggled with all these issues for many, many years. And it's not that journalists have all of a sudden changed the way they've written about these people. It's just that the readers have also been better able now to put themselves in those people's shoes, because it can happen to them also.
Yeah, if I can just add, I mean, words have a very powerful way of telling a story, and how we decide to use those words impacts the narrative that's being shared. And so it's really upon everyone, journalists and us advocates, to ensure that the proper terminology is being used when addressing or discussing these situations.
Yes, when it comes to policy, Seamus and Ben, what would you like to see more coverage in the way of journalism?
I think the one thing that stands out to me, and this is, I'm just borrowing from Matthew Desmond in his book, Evicted, is that evictions are not just a consequence of poverty, but they also create poverty, right? They're a driver of poverty. And so thinking about, that, right, there are real problems in the legal system and real inequalities about how evictions play out. But the other side of this is also that on a public policy level, that we aren't helping people at this moment of crisis in their lives, and a moment of crisis that if it's solved, people can remain stably housed. But if it's not, it destabilizes their whole lives. And so thinking about what are the public policy solutions that we need? I mean, one of them, if you look at our incoming president, has advocated for a universal housing voucher program, right? I mean, significant rental assistance to the lowest income people is a huge part of that solution over the long term. The short term with COVID, we need rental assistance both from the federal government and from the state government to deal with this momentary emergency we find ourselves in. But over the long term, I think what many countries in Europe have found is that it is much cheaper in the short term to make sure that the lowest income people have stable housing than it is to deal with the consequences over the long term of what that means for their lives, and the destabilizing factor that has on children, on health, on so many other factors.
I'd just like to say everything that Seamus said one more time, but with more exclamation points on it, because I think he characterized it very well. So I would love for us to be able to come out of this pandemic not only having addressed the needs of those who are in crisis, but really setting ourselves up for a society in which we have more resiliency, and our public policy structures do that. In the short term, there are immediate things that all of us need to be doing, advocating, both in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C. Our current eviction moratorium is set to expire in the end of February. There was legislation introduced on Monday by Assemblymember David Chu that would extend that through the balance of the calendar year. Obviously, that's just critically important. There are talks in Washington to do another round of CARES Act stimulus. The last I saw this morning, tragically, is that yet again, it looks like those negotiations may be stumbling. We have to get the message to folks in Washington to get past their partisan differences and to get more direct relief to renters, as we saw with the CARES Act earlier this year, as we saw with the HEROES Act that passed out of the House but didn't make it in the Senate. So there are critical things that need to happen in the short term, but we need to be thinking, as Seamus did, towards long-term solutions like universal vouchers as well, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we have an economic crisis.
Yes, very good. Locally, Brandy and Mario, we have a question from Leslie. How are these services, I guess maybe the housing retention grant, made available to the undocumented community? Just briefly, once again, maybe give us your take on how they can be made available.
Sure, I'll go first. Like I said, we don't ask for lawful status. It's not one of the requirements of the process. So we don't even ask when we're helping a family. We ask for identification. In the state of California, anyone can get a driver's license now. That's what we use as proof of the individual's residence and that they're paying.
Okay.
We ask for a copy of their rental agreement or mortgage. That's how we know how much they owe and how much they're paying monthly. So that is a way, again, the less we ask, the less we know, and therefore we don't have to share. So finding ways to not ask.
Mario, do you have a hotline number? Do you want to share really quick?
Sure, they can call us at 559-237-2961 or 559-369-6349. I'll add those numbers to the chat.
Very good. And Brandy, if you could add the hotline number there, if you don't mind.
Sure. Our legal advice line at CCLS is 800-675-8001. As Mario made reference to earlier, we are an LSC funded organization, so we are limited, unfortunately, to being able to help U.S. citizens and those with legal permanent resident status. But we still welcome people to call. We refer those out where we can. A lot of them, as I said, we do send to Centro La Familia, but we also have some other organizations we know have housing help or food support. There are all sorts of things that we have just on our list of resources that sometimes we can help with. In non-COVID times, we had a legal clinic at both the Tulare County and Fresno County courthouses. And those do not require, because we don't take on representation, those do not require any kind of legal status. It's not a question we ask at that point. We're trying to figure out how to get that back up and running as a virtual service so that we can continue to offer that availability in COVID times. We're not quite there yet, but we are working on it.
Very good. Thank you so much. And we have not a question from Rebecca Salgado, more of a referral. The New American Legal Clinic at San Joaquin College of Law is providing free legal services for immigrants, matters including naturalization, adjustment of status, and removal defense. Just another great local resource. Thank you so much, Rebecca. We have a question from Eric German, Retro Report. Eviction has often been seen and covered in the media as a private crisis. Can any of you talk about how COVID may have changed public perception about stakes of individual evictions for the communities where they are taking place? Any idea, Dr. Oguachu?
Okay, let me understand the question. How COVID has changed the perception or has changed the coverage of eviction? Is that the question, please?
Yes, I believe so. I've lost it on my screen, but yes, I believe so.
Okay, I think it has, like everything else, like COVID took the problems that existed and kind of put it on steroids. You know, this is something that someone I interviewed from Leadership Council told me many months ago. So everything is exaggerated. And we know that the government, of course, with all the moratoriums and all the retention grants, have reached out to many people and are trying to keep more people at home. Of course, there's shift in perspectives as more and more people become aware of what is available and what is going on, that it's no longer just limited to one community, because any one of us who loses their job can equally be homeless in a short, in a short time. And I think that it's mostly a shift in perception, in my view, from the public, not the way the the journalists have covered it. What it has become, it's become a much larger issue in the coverage because more people are impacted. But I think it's just that the public perception has changed somewhat.
I see. Very good. Mario, did you want to? Oh, yes. Please chime in, Ben.
I'm just going to say, look, 1 million California families have been economically impacted by the COVID crisis. At least 250,000 California families, we estimate, have been unable to pay rent. I mean, this is something that's not just a story. I mean, odds are you know somebody, or you know somebody who is in this situation. So I think it's risen up out of its normal contours. It's risen up also into more moderate income renter households too, which is really new. We haven't had that before. So it's touching everybody.
My question to everyone is that so many people around here, and I imagine across the strait, maybe the nation, the state, maybe the nation, is that so many people were rent burdened prior to the pandemic. And then when the pandemic came around, well, here we are, and it is so much more difficult. Are those the stories I imagine that you're hearing there, Brandy?
Yeah, so a lot of the time what we've had are people who were very much on the edge already, and they were barely getting by. We know there's a lack of affordable housing in Fresno. We know that people are rent burdened to a great degree, and that's before COVID ever did hit us. And sometimes it one paycheck or reduced hours, so a smaller paycheck was the difference between, okay, I can keep my head above water barely, and I can't. So yes, it's been a huge difference and very abrupt for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And
if I can just add, Dan, the fact that so much of the money that's actually earned goes into rent, paying for rent. The amount that it costs to actually rent in communities like Fresno, it's disproportionate to what a family earns on a monthly basis to what they actually pay for rent. It's a high percentage here in our community.
Yeah, and
Very
also, just before the election, I did a story on Prop 21, whether it was a good or bad thing, and also found that 69% of extremely low-income households in our Fresno area pay much more than 50% of their income in rent, and which leaves them with barely anything left for food and other basics. And you compare that with only 3% of middle income or regular income people paying the same. And we're talking about people who are making minimum income and with COVID, probably no income at all, having to come up with that much money.
Yes, those are amazing stats right there. And in case I didn't define what rent burdened is that's barely having enough money to make your monthly rent and buying food and gasoline and making other household payments and sort of stuff like that. We have a question from
Dan,
Yes.
Could I just chime in
Of
on
course.
one other thing, which is that I think that the other thing that COVID has shown us is just how connected evictions can be to health. And so a couple of studies just came out that demonstrated that up until September, that they believe that evictions across the country led to 400,000 additional COVID cases and 10,000 additional deaths that are directly related to people being evicted from their homes. That because people have to move into overcrowded conditions, that some people become homeless, that has exacerbated the public health crisis. And I think that is a particular moment that we find ourselves in the pandemic, but it's also indicative of some of the other ways that evictions and the crises that people find themselves around housing affect the broader health of our communities.
Yes, and one of the great many residents who invited me into their homes, they were so stressed out that it led to a separation. And it was just so incredibly stressed for them. And I thank them so much just for sharing. We are near the end of, yes, Brandy.
Sorry, if I could just, if anyone is interested in more of the numbers and the data about rent burden, this is a pre-COVID study, but Faith in the Valley did a study called Evicted in Fresno with input from Leadership Council, from Fresno State, from CCLS, and it's called Evicted in Fresno. Isadora already posted it once, but if you wouldn't mind posting it again, just so everybody can see. It's the closest thing to comprehensive data accumulation that we have in Fresno specifically, and it's modeled after the way that Matthew Desmond and Eviction Lab have collected information.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. And panelists, we're getting near the end of our session. I wanted to ask for any closing thoughts from each of you. Dr. Oguwochi.
I think that it's great that we're able to gather and talk about these, but I think it would even be better if we didn't. We must look at policies, policy change. What can we do to ensure everyone access to a roof over their heads? That should be a basic right. And also, what are the resources that are out there for people who are struggling? That we have to figure out, because whereas it was easy before to visit a few churches and tell people what to do, or to visit schools and give flyers to students that they took back to their parents, COVID has made it nearly impossible. And we must take whatever opportunity there is to get to people, especially the ones that are the least privileged, and help and provide our services in whatever ways we can to guide people to help that sometimes is available to help them regain their footing. And I think it's about empathy also, understanding that every single one of us could also be in that situation.
Very good. Well said, Doctor. Thank you so much. Seamus, please.
So often we think about housing from our own sort of the way we deal with it, right? We like pay a rent or something like that, but that housing is one of the most regulated commodities that exists, right? The government decides, you know, how many bedrooms you have, whether you can build an apartment. They decide, you know, how your wiring works in your house. They decide so many aspects of this, and that we have the housing system, that we have the public policy around, that this isn't an accident, that so much about the kind of housing system we have around this country is determined by public policy, and that we ought to pay attention to the kind of results that it's producing and change the underlying public policy.
Very good. Thank you so much, Seamus. Ben, parting thoughts, please.
First, thank you for having us here. It's really a fantastic conversation. I think that this is, we're in the midst of an unbelievable tragedy on top of a tragedy. It was a housing crisis that has been amplified by a health crisis. And I think we have to hope that there is a silver lining that comes out of this, that there is a moment in this where both a political window of opportunity opens up for change among our policymakers, but also where simply because all of us have been so personally impacted, we've seen the consequences of governmental failure in housing and in health, that it motivates to realize that just as government has failed to do certain basic things, government can also be pushed to do certain things, and through our collective action and organizing, maybe that's more within reach than it might have otherwise been. So that's the silver lining that I hope for.
Very good. Thank you so much. Mario, parting thoughts, and if you could please give us the hotline number once again.
I mean, my final thoughts are basically around the fact that we are thankful that we are able to come together and start talking about this issue. It is an issue that's not only here in Fresno, but nationally, that's affecting thousands of families nationwide. It's something that needs to get addressed. It's something that needs to get pushed so that our policymakers make the right decisions to ensure that our families are protected, regardless of status, regardless of how they got here, regardless of the individual, that everyone's taken into account, everyone's considered when these policies, decisions are made to ensure that everyone's protected from having to face an eviction, or ensuring that the eviction process is both fair and a just process for everyone. And again, anyone who needs any help, regardless of whether or not we're the right place to call, reach out to us. We can be reached at 559-237-2961 or 559-369-6349. Reach us. If we're not the right place, we'll help you find the right place.
Very good. Thank you so much, Mario, for being with us. Brandy, parting thoughts, and please share the contact information for the hotline.
Sure. I think the first thing I want to say is thank you so much for involving me and the work that CCLS is doing in this panel. You've got a panel of policy experts, and I'm, I guess, sort of the opposite of that, which is the down in the mud expert. What I really want people to know is that CCLS is here. We want to help as much as we can. We're spreading our resources as much as we can, and we want people to call us. Just like Mario said, if we're not the right place, we'll help you find the right place to call. You can always use this as a starting point. And our legal advice line is 800-675-8001.
Very good. Thank you so much. And all of you have been such great guests. Thank you so much. And before I turn it back over to Bonnie, I just, it's been a fascinating hour. We love to stay in touch with all of you, and I will do so. And we're so looking forward to sharing our Fresno project with all of you in just a couple of weeks. But please continue to share all of your information. Please continue to do all of the great and fascinating work that you are doing throughout, whether it's here in our community or state and nationwide. What a great group of panelists. And thank you so much. Bonnie.
Yeah, what Dan said. I mean, thank you, all of you, for being so articulate and informed about this topic. And I was particularly struck with what Seamus said, the sort of 1-2 punch of people losing their jobs and then losing their homes. And we're really in a unique moment. And Matt Desmond has said that this might be the first time since World War II where there is really an opportunity to look deeply at our housing policies and perhaps be a moment of change. And with that, I will put in one final plug for our piece in Fresno and our hour-long documentary, which hopefully will be out later this summer. So thanks all of you, and we hope that you'll stay in touch as our rolling reporting on this important topic continues.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.